Welcome back to your technocommunism conversation, and happy holidays. I haven't celebrated any religious literalist occasion in my life, um, but nevertheless, that's a thing that people like to say, and you might be saying it to people now. So there you have it. I haven't tagged anyone in this show. Some I don't know. I don't really know what to say about that. People are not interested in tech accelerationist ideas. For the most part, the people who are interested in tech accelerationist ideas are horrible people, and people who are good people, uh, they might hear these words um, uh, that advanced computing is the most powerful tool that's ever existed and could be used to revolutionary ends, and that this species will go extinct if we don't do something along those lines because we're being pushed into capitalism's climate apocalypse by the United States. It's the chief force behind that. For the most part, people who talk about ending uh, that, they do not talk about this technological possibility or imperative. And when you say this to them, they say, oh, that passes the laugh test. But they're not engaging with it, and they're not really engaging with revolution. I don't think either. I don't because I don't think that if you're um, um, if you're not thinking about and talking about and organizing toward using this, for the most part, people are not too pleased by the idea of autarky, uh, the idea of um, an, an economic power within the land that they live. And so they're happy to ignore the dictatorship of capital that dominates the Western world and dominates the entire world thanks to the U.S. military-industrial complex. They're happy to pretend that that's not as big of a problem as it is, just as they're quite happy to remain talking in abstractions about what would supplant it. And I've met a handful of people in this world who are not that, and they are most assuredly not the people that I've met on Facebook.com, where I'm streaming this from now. I was putting this show on YouTube as a somewhat edited show, and instead of going live as I am now. And uh, I decided to just start going live because it's a little less work. I can just then put it on other platforms, and people can just fast forward through the parts they don't like if it's not as tight as it was before. That's fine. Not that many people are watching this show to begin with. Um, uh, let's see. Well, I thought one reason I didn't tag people, aside from um, being tired of having this conversation where I say um, what I just said in response to them saying, why are you putting this in my timeline? Is because I was going to talk about some dreams that I had. And more or less just as a kind of dream journal, because I wanted, they were vivid dreams that I had in recent days, and I wanted to remember them. Um, uh, One was when I was on a video conference call. I was with my mother and sister, and we were on a video conference call with my grandmother, who was um, employed into her 70s, as people often are in the United States, and if for some reason she was working in a pizzeria. And even though I'm an advocate for plant-based, um, my dreams don't adhere to that advocacy apparently, because I was dreaming about this earlier time where I'm with my family and having a pizza. And by the way, you can get uh, plant-based cheeses on pizza now that taste the same as any other pizza. They've gotten quite good. Um, and the plant-based meats, of course. So it's not impossible that I would have a pizza of this kind with loved ones. But and so my grandmother never worked in a pizzeria. Um, if I'm not mistaken, she did work, work in a place a little bit similar, some other food service, as a retiree. And uh, the in the dream, then we were going to go somewhere else, and we realized that we had called my grandmother on video for some reason to order a pizza, and then she had not followed the usual protocols of talking to customers, and she just put us on hold as she had another call, and then so we were kind of all still on hold. We were doing something else, and then we realized that we could all still hear each other. And it was then in the dream where the only person who is deceased was in the dream. It was my grandfather. My grandmother's about 90 years old now and still living. Um, and so then they were driving somewhere and we were driving somewhere, and we were all on a video call, and it seemed quite real. And then I woke up, and whenever I have a dream where someone who's deceased is in it, and I'm thinking, oh, but not thinking that they're deceased in the dream, then then I always wake up and think, oh, that was nice. Oh, that never could happen today because they're gone. Another dream that I just had, I probably should be able to recall it a little better than that, was about a fictional person that I'd made up. It seems I was working in some kind of university setting, which I have done, but apparently in some kind of custodial capacity, which I haven't done in the university setting, or some kind of scholarly setting. And so I guess I was cleaning a kitchen in like a big kitchen in an office, and I did something like fixed a microwave, or was messing with the microwave or something, and I bump into this guy, not a real guy that I met, and in the course of some small talk, he then quotes Marx in kind of a punny way, and then I immediately said, well, I gather from what you said that you're an instructor, and you're quoting Marx, and you seem to have some background in economics. Are you a Marxist economist? And he says, yes, I am. And then we're talking about things to do with theory, which didn't get too in depth in the dream. And then he shares with me a pamphlet. This is weird because somehow then I guess I'm more in his space. Maybe he's living in kind of a dormitory or housing on the campus. It's a dream. It doesn't always make a lot of sense. Um, and he shares a pamphlet with me that's on his coffee table or something. He's got a bunch of papers around and things like this around, and 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 then it's something to do with it's some kind of semi-satirical thing to do with Israel. Uh, so I guess the suggestion of the dream was that um, he was an academic who was both critical but in some sense connected with Israel, and it was a bizarre it was a bizarre dream, but it also maybe because it happened more recently, um, it seemed no less real than the dream that involved real people that I've known, which I guess you say of every dream, really. So those are two dreams that I had recently. Really top shelf material here. Um, I will. Uh, I guess I'll read a little of something now to do with some concepts in technocommunism. Um, there is this thing that we face, capitalism's climate apocalypse. We are possibly just a few decades away from an extinction level event of human design, and that it will be a foregone conclusion in approximately 5 years, according to all of the serious climate scientists. If we do not take steps to stop this planet from being in permanent breach of a 2-degree increase in temperature. And that situation is not as complex or mystical as it sounds. We need a new economic system. As I mentioned, this is a show about Marxist economics. I was talking to someone this week, and I suggested that they read this this piece that I published also on this site and others as only as an audiobook and only really for a handful of people. And this is a pamphlet. The video is about 2 hours, just under 2 hours, I guess you would say. And the pamphlet is called How to Use AI to Build Communism in Your Lifetime, because if we don't, humans will soon become extinct. So I was talking to somebody about some of these ideas, and they said I read a little bit here and there what you're talking about, and I'm going to try to read your audiobook. And I was going to follow up with that by saying you should come on a podcast, as that's something I say to people. Not that often, but fairly often. If they're not somebody who's so well known to me, I'll say it. Because most people online are kind of not who they say they are. A lot of them seem to be behaving in ways that are inconsistent or even a little insane. If you'll permit that. I don't like characterizing anyone in that way, but the online personality compared to the real world personality, it seems to be a feature of it, which is a feature of really the unreality of it all. Even before you could interact with things like ChatGPT that could approximate a human level conversation. Even before that, there were a billion plus fake accounts, literal chatbots or sock puppet accounts manned by a human being on across social media, and they were all poisoning the conversation to make it less coherent. But generally, they don't really care about coherency or incoherency, except that it is in service to elitism, and that is, of course, all in service to private wealth. Um, and so this space where you would meet someone and they say, "Oh, I'm just a regular guy like you," and as often as not, you'll find out that that's not who they really are. That they're not being serious. So I sometimes will just say, "Hey, you're so interested in this? Come on my podcast and we'll talk about it." And usually they don't because they have something else to do. But when they do, and I have a way of knowing if they're a real person or not, and so there you have it. Um, uh, None of this is concepts as I threatened to talk about, but of course, ecological catastrophe that we face, which is not an act of God divorced from human action, nor is it even should something we can attribute to human action. It's something we can attribute to this ill-conceived economic system controlled by private wealth as opposed to the public interest that's leading us into a climate death spiral that could lead to the death of, at minimum, billions of people in the decades to come. The premature expiration of billions of people is already a fact of life under this dictatorship of capital. And that situation seems to be getting worse. As I said, stepsister, passed away this year, a younger woman than myself, and would have seemed to have been a complication of long COVID. I see people online saying things, and they're backing it up with reasonable science, that every time you're getting this COVID, the effect on your immune system, your cardiovascular system, your mind is such that you might be taking 10 years off your life every time you're getting coronavirus, and you're all just getting it over and over again. My state has 16% um, um, of the people getting a vaccine, and I would say about that number or less of people wearing a mask. I don't even think that they publish the masking numbers because it's against this neoliberal mandate. Um, they determined that masking was something that is not going to be helping private wealth, and so now it's been dismissed by people who have no money. How many of these? The difference between these 16% of people in my state, which is the lowest, by the way, vaccination rate in the country. My state is, you make jokes about Florida man or Texas man, but Arizona man, he's just as big of hyper-nationalistic imbecile. So this space between the people who are vaccinated and the people who are masking, who are those people? The difference between those people, that's all working poor people, basically, in that area, and so they are not protecting private wealth because they are rich. They're protecting private wealth because they are brainwashed and really, really, really stupid. There have never been people to walk the face of the earth stupider than the Americans. You say, well, how do you know that, Ben? Well, I am not convinced that human beings are a sapient species, because a sapient species would have within its power the ability to not destroy itself by the bad use of industrial technology, and the sapient species would be able to embrace things like using an AI takeoff to build a sustainable and humane economic system rather than making the situation worse, as we're doing under the fascistic U.S. regime. Um, um, so, um, this I guess this problem of the capitalist climate apocalypse situation of the climate death spiral that's going to keep killing people in slow motion. My stepsister shouldn't have died. I could say this of 20 people. They were young people, and they shouldn't have died. The capitalism killed them. Um, and so it doesn't happen the way it does in the movies, right? Where everybody stands on the beach and a huge tidal wave from the comet that just hit Earth crushes them all. Right? It's a little more complicated than that, and so there's a lot of you just assuming that it's something else that's happening, and just bad luck. Um, uh, but this capitalism's climate apocalypse really, aside from the pressing need, which should always be underscored, to change the economic system and take revolutionary action to that end. Uh, I don't know that I'm the best person in doing this, but I at least try to say this. Um, and aside from those necessaries, it really does come down to a handful of specific sectors in this economic system, which it has no the current fascistic economic regime of the U.S. Controlled West has no ability to address. They can't stop. There's no recourse. There's no adults in the room anywhere. And so to say, oh, we could get rid of these sectors is to say we could build a new economic system. Those are the same idea. But the sectors themselves really are all petroleum products. The United States' biggest companies throughout living memory are automotive companies, and then other petroleum products, the DuPonts and the Dows, and others providing some other things along these lines are also very high on that list. There's a few others on the list in between in terms of their size and influence. To some degree, you could say that this second cause of climate change after this collection of fossil fuel fascistic organizations is livestock systems, which are underrepresented in the public imagination when you consider the devastating impact they have on our planet. I see a lot of discourse about how we should have been not purchasing Starbucks and McDonald's all along, as if many people are boycotting them now, as well they should. But very little of that conversation talks about the fact that these products and any animal products, in fact, are this second contributor after this fossil fuel products to this climate apocalypse. It really quite is like the The David Sirota penned a film, Don't Look Up, where people are actively ignoring their own demise because they're more invested in creature comforts than they are in their own survival. Um, so what has happened because of this ecological catastrophe, instead of the appropriate thing, people coming together and fighting for a humane and sustainable economic system run by advanced computing, which now makes it possible to run a planned economy in ways that everybody was surprised. So in a couple of this flash crash course of 20th century history, right? Everybody was surprised that the Soviet Union came into existence. That is, to say, economic theorists were surprised. They said we should have seen more education before this happened. And they were similarly quite surprised that a planned economy came into existence. None of that was really the problem in the running of the USSR per se. The problem that I'm going to discuss how advanced computing could run planned economies with greater resources and versatility than what existed in the 20th century should not be seen as a critique of what occurred in the 20th century. Just as I said, everyone was surprised. Western fascists were surprised that this thing had come into existence at all, and they immediately, the day that this revolutionary government came into being in 1917, they immediately planned a murderous campaign that killed many, many people that began in 1918 to wipe this socialist country off the map. And they tried to do the same thing just a few years later in China as well. That's to say, immediately invading to kill the socialist country in its crib. It's something the United States has done successfully with the USSR, and done successfully to such a degree that you could say that a people's will and mandate for a humane and sustainable economic system, the very thing that would have prevented this capitalist climate apocalypse, has been successfully destroyed and undermined in 100 nations. If you're looking at the ripple effects, and people will say, "Oh, a lot of things happen," just as people will say this of the those dying around them from capitalism or capitalism's climate apocalypse, they'll attribute it to other things. They're very, very glad elitists, bootlicking fucking dogs, are very glad to change the subject whenever they can when things to do with their bootlicking and the economic system come up. So this is the only thing that you should ever really say about the Soviet Union. Most Marxists are really some kind of amateur historical recreationists, Soviet historians, and what that really amounts to is what it amounts to in a larger population in conversations about this, which is blaming the victim. Because the only thing that you should really need to say about the Soviet Union is the fascist West did exactly what they did in 1918 for all the decades after, which is to say, sought to destroy it. And it's funny that the popular mythology about the Soviet Union revolves so much about intelligence services. Right? This is a psychological operation. This is a psyop, the fact that you focus on intelligence services. You know, I think of the show The Americans, left liberal garbage. And it was a show about these, what's the word that they would use? There's a word in common parlance in tradecraft in recent decades, in spycraft, and I can't think of it at the moment, but it's just a word for a sleeper agent in this context. So they had these, uh, well, just the term Americans, the Americans in the show refers to not just Americans generally, but these Soviet sleeper agents who could pass as Americans. So think about how many people believe that this is a real thing, or that the concept of the Soviet super spy generally. The Soviet intelligence is a small thing in world history compared to what I was just discussing, right? The destruction of 100 million people, the murder by death or social murder, by murder or social murder, that all lays at the feet of the fascist U.S. of 100 million people in recent centuries. That's not including all of the people that were murdered, all of the native folks that were murdered before Marx's works were written, let's say, or African folks who were murdered before around that time. Just but many tens of millions of people in the 170 years since. Um, and why were they murdered? So uh, uh, for the same reason that you have the Soviet super spy silliness taking up so much space in the public conversation of things of this kind, um, to prevent any challenge to private wealth and the fascistic institutions have existed only to uphold it, right? Not to help human beings. That's another myth. There's no basis in fact that this economic system is helping you. That's why there's so much cognitive dissonance around capitalism's climate apocalypse, because to even consider the possibility of this annihilation is to understand, almost without real great analysis, that this U.S. Led abomination of neoliberal far right capitalism and imperialism is the cause of this situation. And again, it comes down to a certain number of products as well. The United But one thing what I failed to say in this talking about fossil fuels and livestock systems is, of all of the organizations, the United States military is the worst polluter, and a lot of that is through fossil fuels and things, right? But nevertheless, that is what should be said there as well. It's not merely that the system is being upheld that is killing human beings, but it is that the people who are policing the world in service to fascism are also themselves the worst polluters. Um, so what is the concept of technocommunism? We're talking about a world that envisions a transformation using advanced computing that's harnessed for the greater good, that's able to provide services, and would also have to necessarily, in this the years before a technosocialist or technocommunist outcome, would have to be used in other ways besides just the simple provision of services. The USSR, had they not been under constant attack, would have been focused on the simple provision of services. Instead, they did other things that didn't make a lot of sense, like getting caught in a runaway arms race that cost them very dearly. Um, and so under this fascistic system and just the madness of Western dominion generally, these would necessarily have to be things that would be more weapons of war, as much weapons of war as more so than you would prefer once this work is done. But it's more important perhaps to talk about what we can do to better articulate the techno-communist run world. And so then focusing on how an AI planned economy could ensure humanity's survival in where areas where these fascists are failing us most dramatically. Um, the advent of artificial superintelligence, which I don't think should be such a fuzzy concept, right? I can have a conversation with Mistral. I've talked about Llama on this show. I've talked at length about ChatGPT or Claude. Those are three examples of these things that you can use. Claude and ChatGPT are easiest to use. So you don't have to have a special computer. You don't have to download anything and take a hard drive space and set something up. So that's a barrier to entry for people. So I think it's fair to say we should use Mistral. Mistral is better than Llama 2 as an alternative to ChatGPT on a few levels. It has more tokens. Also, it wasn't made by fascists, which is always nice. That's kind of the point of not using, one of the points of not using ChatGPT. So Mistral is one that I've been using. I mentioned Llama 2 in that context, but I've started using Mistral too. I have to admit that I'm sometimes forced to use Claude because Claude can basically read a whole book at one time, and I'm sometimes forced to use ChatGPT code because it can't read a whole book at one time, but it doesn't limit the number of times you can ask it questions, and it doesn't quite break down in the way that Mistral does. Unfortunately, there's not a network of these things being maintained collectively the way that these ChatGPT or Claude's networks are maintained by these for-profit concerns. It should be ad hoc concerns that are not profit-based that are maintaining these kinds of things. This is Alexa, stop. This is a moment in history when I realized that things were getting a little off track from the, I guess, reformist notions that I had in the 90s or 2000s of thinking that a techno-utopian outcome would come as a matter of course in defiance of the current economic system, that we were just happily transitioning from one economic system to another. I'm very ashamed to say that I believed that this was happening for some years of my life. And one moment that made me realize that that might not be the case was when there was something called Firefox, an internet browser that was maintained more or less in the principles that I just described, not for profit, and people working together to make that a possibility. When that was supplanted by none other than military contractor Google and Google Chrome becoming the dominant market share of internet browsers. When that happened, that was a moment, some 15 or so years ago, that you realize that the techno-fascists are winning. And that's become increasingly clear, I think, to me and many people in the years since. Well, what are these concepts in technocommunism? To truly realize the potential of technocommunism, the abolition of private wealth is a pillar of technocommunist thought, so to speak. the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few has, to this day, more than in any time, perpetuated inequality and hindered progress toward a more equitable society. You should know that an AI takeoff would have already occurred if the United States has just said, and the fascist West had just said, well, this is it. We're transitioning from one economic system to another, um, as I imagined we might be, wrongly. If they had just said that and not undermined and attacked the Soviet Union at every turn, and not undermined and attacked China, and much less stable nations than those who never even saw the light of day. As I said, 100 nations have gone from being socialistic to fascistic because of this axis of evil led by the United States. And if that had not been the case, an AI takeoff would have already occurred. Um, the Soviet propaganda, if you look at Soviet propaganda from the 20th century, they weren't talking about what the U.S. propaganda was talking about. The United States said, you need to bend over and kiss your ass goodbye because the nuclear apocalypse is going to kill you. That was the gist of a lot of U.S. propaganda. Soviet propaganda didn't want to be spending money on runaway arms race that they were forced into or tricked into. Um, they wanted to be doing what I'm saying, things like an AI takeoff. So they talked about scientism and scientific socialism. That was the rest of their propaganda, but it's hard. Just as if I was just saying scaremongering things exclusively, I would be able to reach these knuckleheads who say, hey, don't talk to me about technocommunism. You're fucking pieces of shit. You're all on Robot Santa's naughty list. um, and the it's much of the story of the 20th century could be said to be proving this axiom, so to speak, proving this old chestnut, or affirming this old chestnut that you can control people more easily with fear than you can with reason. Um, but if we hadn't lived in this hell world of insensate beasts, of non-sapient humanity, um, then this AI takeoff would have easily happened. And that's down to pretty small changes, right? It's down to institutional changes because, it's not fair to you for me to just say, oh, you're so fucking stupid, that's why the planet's dying. Right? This is institutional problems, and these are fascistic institutions causing these institutional problems. But the focus absolutely would have been, I contend, for example, that the destruction of the Soviet Union and the attempted destruction at the same time frame of China by these fascist forces was a direct response to this possibility of an AI takeoff. It is no coincidence, I believe, that in the years that advanced computing systems were developed, when they were conceived of, they were conceived as something that could be kept under glass and used by fascistic institutions exclusively in the West. So computers, in a Colossus, a Forbin project, a book and film that describes some of this kind of AI takeoff concept. It's just a giant server room. It's right, and it's still kind of essentially in the public consciousness only as something that's controlled by fascistic institutions. But by the 70s, we had begun to develop the possibility of network technology. This was done by the same fascistic institutions so that they could be more connected to one another. But not everybody was just going to go along with the idea that only fascists would ever be able to use this. So at that point, people who think about these things said, well, the genie might be about to come out of the bottle here, the genie of technocommunism, essentially. And the Soviet Union is for people who had been talking about things of this kind in their propaganda and in their stated goals for years. Um, so I believe that this just as this transition from Firefox to Chrome, from something that's open source to something that's controlled by a military contractor, was indeed no accident in the imperial core. This destruction at the time when it would have become a bootloader for a specific kind of class consciousness to do with tech acceleration, building the institutions necessary for all of that. It's no accident that the Soviet Union was destroyed. The United States could have nuked the Soviet Union in decades prior. That would have backfired. But the point is, they finally were able to destroy it because it had become more of an exigency because of the prospect of hyperconnectivity and the implications of scientific socialist thought in that context. If you, as a technocommunist, as a thinker of any kind, if you're going to advocate for anything at all in this world, it must be for the dismantling of private wealth structures, of fascistic structures, and the open defiance of said in every way. And the only way to really do that is to fight against the military industrial complex. I was having kind of one-sided conversation with someone on Twitter.com, as I'll still call it. This someone was named Marion Williamson. She doesn't have conversations directly with me because she's a massive tool, but also because she has a few million followers and I have a few thousand. But she had said something to the effect of it was vaguely critical of the institutions of private wealth, and it referenced this concept of fascist dictatorship at the doorstep. So presumably a reference to Trump, who's no more of a fascist dictator than Joseph Biden, whom she endorsed. The planet's dead either way, right? Whether you have a colorful fascist dictatorship or a less colorful fascist dictatorship. So I said, this social democrat, this is clearly established in 20th century histories, is that social democrats rat-fucked and ultimately became fascists because they're more dedicated to private wealth than they are to socialism. They're not socialists. So that's who somebody like Marion Williamson, and I'm not going to say that every democratic socialist or social democrat is that person, but I will say that a fucking Zionist like Marion Williamson, person who's on a public-facing personality who has millions of followers, who's even a little bit on the fence about Zionism, and a little bit on the fence, and more than a little bit on the fence about the military-industrial complex in general, is definitely no less the fascist at the doorstep than Trump. Which is by the same forces that the forces that colluded to put Hitler in power and Mussolini in power are people like Marion Williamson. So is Marion Williamson Hitler, or is Marion Williamson the power player behind Hitler. Fuck both of those guys. Right? Um, um, it's a techno-communist future, which is a techno-utopian future, which is a distinct possibility in the years to come. We unfortunately face this choice between a utopian and not merely dystopian, but a total annihilation outcome is really the only two options. As an AI acceleration, AI takeoff prospect. Um, um, those are the only two AI takeoff scenarios, and we're looking at an AI takeoff, so I can't see why people would pretend that there's anything other than those two possibilities. Um, it requires mass consciousness and mass action. Popular movements of this kind um, can be built, particularly in this time when not only humanable economic systems and policies are on people's minds, but sustainability is, you know, I've seen discourse also on Twitter.com and other places where the question of ecosocialism comes up. And the question of ecosocialism from a Marxist point of view is it central to scientific socialism, or is it something more like what Marianne Williamson would do in this situation? And my feeling is that we have 5 years to change the economic system. So just as I urge people not to use words like adventurism when talking about those taking any kind of action, performative or more direct action against fascistic systems, we've got to need a whole hell of a lot more adventurism. You pretty well have to be willing to be the mosquito flying into the little blue light at this point, because it's going to be a foregone conclusion that your species will not exist if we don't do a good deal more of adventurism. I generally regard communists who refer to some project as ill-conceived as people who are not people who are going to be taking those actions, certainly, and people who are operating against the interest of a humane and sustainable economic system and a world that continues to exist. Um, um, this this arc of AI development is the arc of human survival and the arc of economic systems. These are all one and the same. Um, uh, so we have to be pushing for things that prioritize things like open source, bring back Firefox. We have to do things like that in 100 ways. But we also have to, most importantly, create a popular movement that's able to exert pressure on governments and bring fascist governments at minimum to heel, if not preferably force them to non-existence. Namely, this ringleader of the grand ecocide, the grand genocide, the ecocidal project, and the ringleader is, of course, the United States. Um, um, so there's a lot of things that you could do, and I don't know that I'm the best one to even talk about some of them, because um, for fuck's sake, I have other communists telling me they don't want to talk about this in a limited circle of people that I'm able to speak to. And, you know, I would kick the living shit out of you if you said that to me in real life, you understand? But on social media, this exigency is lost on most of us, and I've been guilty of it many, many times before recent years. So it's not, of course, fair to say that you should be beaten for defying for defying me. But I think you understand that we're all going to be dead soon. if we don't figure out how to do this. So how can an AI takeoff safeguard humanity? Um, uh, well, the AI takeoff, I think, is occurring, and it's being run by the likes of Google, military contractors. So it's being run by fascists in disguise. And not, of course, everyone is as hard fascistic. Not every tech development comes from the United States, for example. More and more coming from other places further removed from the imperial core, even places that are reasonably socialistic. But nevertheless, that none of that amounts to very much if we don't transform consciousness and organize to those ends in ways that involves hundreds of millions of people. I think that's not happening. You might say, uh, we're close to general strike conditions. The general strike is definitely seen correctly as first stage towards nullifying a fascist institution. It's often come to pass that a general strike will lead to the end of a fascist regime like that of the United States. And so the United States is teetering perhaps on at the edge already. But I don't believe that the thing that replaces it will be better without this thing. That is consciousness and mass organizing toward specific end, the Marxist tech accelerationist organization. Um, uh, well, this has gotten a little bit long. Um, in the stream uh, that I had about this guy that somehow turned to Israel, as dreams are not always in our control, right? So it kind of but I would have imagined that this conversation would have turned to more technical discussion of the economic theory, what it truly would take to build a planned economy run by a hybrid human um, uh, artificial superintelligence. And some people who I've had conversations with say, Ben, you're grasping at a straw. You're grasping at straws here. This consciousness is a thing that has been a possibility for years. It's a thing that's more realized. Consciousness and mass action is more realized than this superintelligence concept. But again, I don't deny that. But we have 5 years, 5 years before we're locked into a climate death spiral. If there is a thing powerful enough to stop that, being a more powerful algorithm that's able to provide greater leverage to um, uh, the kind of action that non-techno-communist communists would describe, then that those people rarely take this eco-socialist position that we have 5 years. Um, they are there's you can scarcely find a communist, much less a capitalist, who is not some kind of greenwasher, some kind of low-key climate apocalypse denier. You will barely find that person. So you have people who say, well, technocommunism is not the solution. It would seem that those people are saying that in bad faith, in service to the status quo, in service to their own demise. Um, even if their points are well made, the thing about consciousness is it can move pretty fast and it can grow pretty large in a pretty short time. And so, if I'm reminded of somebody talking about this in the terms of stone soup, right? Well, then you don't know that much about advanced algorithms when it comes down to it, and it sounds like what you're really just trying to do is do the old story of stone soup, bringing people into this thing, and if enough people come into it, then the thing could be built. This technology is at that place, and of course, that is what a socialist must do. That is why you should be agitation propagandists as well as the better thing, I suppose, being organizers and soldiers. Um, uh, there are many, many threats. I was going to talk about this more specifically about the kinds of authoritarianism that exist in dictatorships of capital, and more specifically about corporate power therein. Of course, there was a lot of this conversation, but my outline was a little more focused on that. But there are many, many, many threats to your survival. This isn't merely as exercise, who gives a fuck about the USSR, right? If I could push a button and have USSR 2.0 tomorrow, I would. I love reading about it. I think it's important in creating a framework for some of this, but they don't exist anymore, right? I care about the Russian people in that context more than I care about the USSR and other peoples that were under that. Everyone, of course. Um, so this is a major failing of Marxist-Leninists, is being this thing that I said, kind of historical recreationists, rather than people who can even acknowledge that there's a possibility of an AI takeoff and organizing to that end. Um, um, and the flip side of that is not acknowledging that we live in an incipient techno-fascist world. So um, there's no sense of reality among these people, really. There's this sense of 20th century. They're just barely understanding the 20th century. They're not even recognizing the century that they live in. I think that this concerted effort, raising of consciousness and organizing and becoming central to the things that are going on, like general strike, like direct actions against military contractors that have occurred because of the increasing disdain for the military-industrial complex that's stemming from the Israeli genocide of Gazan people and the U.S.-run Israeli genocide of Gazan people. This has led to actions against Elbit Systems, military, not merely a military contractor, a weapons builder. Um, those are not exactly synonyms. Like Google is not per se a weapons builder, at least in the 2000 teens. It wasn't building weapons as such, but it was nevertheless a huge military contractor. It became a big company by being a military contractor. Um, and this is all of Silicon Valley. That's why there's such little promise in tech culture generally, in things like transhumanism, is because of these institutions. And again, it's fair to say, oh yeah, you dumb fucks, you're working for a bunch of cops or something, right? That's fair to say. But the institutional failings are really the message. Right? We have to disband all of this. And through these efforts, collectivist thought, collective action, focusing on the advanced algorithm as the bootloader for a techno-utopian outcome, surviving humanity, and we can begin to see benefits that we would not have even expected. Just as I said, that the USSR could have led to a great consciousness for an AI takeoff, and this AI takeoff, this technological singularity would have already occurred, were it not for the fascist West. Um, and this concept is most important to the survival and ultimate flourishing of humanity.